challenges to media freedoms, constraints of ethics, business, and politics. Um, there are many different issues, and it's not necessary for one speaker to do an overview of all of them. So I'm just going to be touching on the two or three things which I think are today basic to the problem, to all the different problems that you see about what media is able to do or not able to do. I think at the core of everything are two things: the health of the media business, as well as the business environment in this country in which the media has to function. Lots of, if I may lay out the issues as I see them, a lot of the constraint is because good journalism is being rendered economically unviable by the financial model that most TV channels and publications follow, which is advertising based. And today both the highest paid and media is fundamentally about journalists, about the people who practice it. So today both the highest paid and the lowest paid journalists are ethically vulnerable, if I may use that term, and sometimes, or usually, mostly for no fault of their own. The advertising-driven model puts pressures on journalists when there's too much competition for the same advertising. So what is seen as this great blossoming of media in this country, that same blossoming which is happily unregulated and there's lots of it and anyone can enter the media and anyone can own it, that is also the problem of, creates the problem of unviability, which then leads people to look for other ways of financing their journalism. Just in January this year, the country's second largest newspaper, second largest sometimes, first largest sometimes, in terms of readership, the Dainik Bhaskar, it had its executive editor in the state of Haryana was incentivizing the paper's bureau chiefs to drive stringers to collect more advertising. And the bureau chiefs in different districts were told that they would get a foreign trip if they reached a certain advertising target. Now, this is not the marketing head who's sending out this circular, but it's the news head. But of course, as you know, first of all, let me just say that much of the regional media, large reach that it has in different states, functions on a model where a few of the news gatherers are proper journalists of paid salaries, huge numbers are stringers. So that's where this whole thing of looking for advertising comes, and they're also expected to collect advertising. The point is that when you approach the local powers that be for advertising, you can't report on their activities with any degree of rigor. The deepening inroads of business over the last 2 decades into editorial spaces has also partly been caused by shrinking budgets for travel or news gathering in TV channels and newspapers, and the need to accept free trips for lifestyle reporting, which incur no cost to company. This no cost to company has become quite a phrase. It's not just some TV shows, entire TV channels today, entire publications can be launched on the notion of no cost to company. The pressure is particularly high in the current business environment for listed companies, listed media companies, which have to show results quarter by quarter. This includes a lot of your high-profile English news channels. Pre-liberalization, no media company was listed at the stock exchange. Now they're, I think, 15 gone up to 20, but that includes news channels like NDTV, which have been in financial doldrums for some time. In fact, just the other day, for the first time in 10 quarters, I think, they were able to show a profit. This is constantly debated, the kind of pressures that come from having to be totally dependent on advertising and show profits all the time in a crowded market. So Rajdeep Sardesai, I remember, has been saying this at public forums, telling critics that we are listed quarter by quarter, we have to show profits. decade. So what's happening is, where it would be healthy if maybe 50% of a publication or channel or anything, advertising sources came from advertising and 50 from cover price. It's more like a 90-10 or a 80-20. And the PR industry is this big thing that's coming. It's been growing faster than the advertising industry. To add to it all, there was this great financial slump over several years, internationally and in India. So all of it has put a pressure on advertising. So the PR industry is welcomed with semi-open arms because it gives you copy for your publications. It gives you raw material for your TV shows. And the new trend is then that the line between advertising, marketing, and PR are all blurring. PR companies create 4 events which you then cover. They also help you get interviews. Actually, what happened, I think, about 10, 12 years ago is post-liberalization, is that you could no longer actually ring up people you knew in any form of business or industry and ask for an appointment. The PR wall came in between sources in economics, in the economic industry, and between journalists.
Yes.
Silence. Shall I just go back to holding? Okay. So I was saying that you have to be able to talk to, supposing you're doing business reporting, there's this huge blossoming of business reporting in India, much more than any other kinds of reporting. And you can no longer directly contact the people in the company. Oh, here we go, James. Shall I just hold it? Yeah. Like before. Was it working then? Okay. Okay, maybe I should finish. It's easier. Okay. So I just want to give some examples. For instance, the private, can you hear now? Is that okay? The private healthcare thing. Why am I saying all this in relation to media freedom? Because all of this affects freedom of how you do your journalism. So the private healthcare sector, including pharmaceutical companies, have created all these things which we don't even think twice about when we cover them. It's World Tobacco Day, there's World Diabetes Day, there's World Anti-Obesity Day, Cancer Day, and so on. But all of it really has its origins in the need to create publicity for itself by the pharmaceutical industry. World Thyroid Day, which you milk when those days come around. And then all kinds of research studies surface which the press happily picks up. When we think of media ethics and business, we think of paid news, we think of private treaties done by the Times Group. Both of those also make journalists ethically vulnerable. Today, increasingly, media ownership is an issue. There's this huge flood of entrants of various kinds. A lot of political people, I think on the hood, we tried to look at the most obviously politically owned companies, and there were at least 36 or 37. There's business coming in or coming back in. And because of the whole vulnerable financial situation, when media companies are vulnerable, then businessmen buy in, politicians buy in, and they also, because transponders are cheap, they also float their own media. So in a sense, ownership is also an issue of media freedom. How free are you when you're owned by a political party? Or, what kinds of self-censorship come when you're owned by business houses and political parties? the environment in which one practices journalism is also a problem in relation to business. When you have to report on clashes between business interests and people wanting to give up lands for projects and not wanting to give up land for projects in different states and so on. One, a lot of the attacks on journalists are coming from this kind of a situation. In Chhattisgarh and Orissa, with the more vulnerable stringers get attacked when they try to cover this clash between industry and tribals or people in general. There may be clashes on the issue of land for people on one side. Industrial conglomerate like the Tatas is on the other side. Now the Tatas are big advertisers, so how are you going to cover that kind of an issue? There is also the situation where a media company is owned by, owns a lot of other businesses. So there's this famous case of Dainik Bhaskar in the state of Chhattisgarh, where they have their own power company. They have DB Bhaskar. So how do they report these struggles? How do they report public hearings? You know, when the media itself is into the power sector, how do you cover the struggles over land for coal mining to feed that power plant? There's self-censorship which operates when business buys you or comes. When Mukesh Ambani acquires prominent media stables, we will need a lot of documentation in the future to see if at all it's resulting in any kind of censorship or self-censorship. Then there's self-censorship by pretty prominent publications. In the case of high-profile, politically connected businessmen like Robert Vadra, we saw quite amazing self-censorship by two major newspaper groups when that story broke. What are the factors that govern that? Editors and protesters and proprietors being close to ruling politicians or something else? So what governs self-censorship in industry reporting is usually fear of losing advertising. And Mr. Markandeya Katju and the Press Council recently released a report on Bihar where they're talking about how what governs self-censorship in reporting on a state government, because again there's a lot of state advertising at stake. In 2010, in Nepal, a Nepal journalist body did a study on self-censorship in Nepal. Found that incidents of organized crime, political corruption, criminal acts, black marketeering, smuggling, these are the issues that Nepal journalists feel they should not cover. They consider it taboo. Why? Because covering it probably makes them very vulnerable. So then there's a very real constraint also of legal threats. And we see that increasingly, which is leading to self-censorship. It began with that 2 years ago with that 100 crore case of P.B. Sawant suing Times Now. They actually had to put down money. Then Times Now thought it would recover part of that money, so it sued the Hoot, which didn't make any difference because we don't have any money. Then you had Shekhar Gupta sort of starting a suit, I don't know what happened to it, against Outlook and Vinod Mehta. And you have Arindam Chaudhary and Caravan magazine. And lately it's been a lot of Arindam Chaudhary. Now, if you don't have a media house that's willing to spend on lawyers, or stick out a trial, or that doesn't get scared by legal notices, that becomes another very effective form of self-censorship. And that is, I think, increasingly a real challenge to media freedom today. What was exposed in the Radia tapes, for instance, is the influence of lobbyists. And it needed to be exposed, but the Tatas sued on grounds of invasion of privacy. Arindam Chaudhary's educational empire can do with scrutiny, but he sues if you point out what his methods are. It's become a real threat. And I think courts need to take a view on this and throw out more cases maybe. I don't know what the solution is, but that is becoming a problem. It's not just about media freedom per se, it's also about just the basics of media functioning. this no cost to company model. The thing is, it's a huge country, there are lots of states, you need lots of reporters, you need lots of bureaus. You don't see any of that happening. We've tried to do monitoring studies on the hood. It shows you how little the states are covered. Unless there's an election or an IPL match, or unless Narendra Modi visits that place, you're not going to get coverage. There are entire states which in over a period of 2 months would not have got even a line of coverage because like the Northeast, the whole 8 states in the Northeast, because you say you neither get votes for parliament from there, nor do you get advertisements from that region. So you don't put in a lot of reporters because the assumption is your readership is not particularly interested. Newspapers and TV channels would need a lot of decently paid journalists to report from the states, meaning not just unpaid stringers, and not just the state capitals, but the rest of the states. But when your cover price revenues are poor and competition is shrinking your advertising revenues, it becomes a problem. I think the one good thing we're seeing recently is that this business of pricing media low because the Indian media market is simply not used to paying for its media. That is changing a little bit. You're getting a lot of magazines at least raising their prices. You're getting newspapers raising their prices. So some of that unviability hopefully will come down, and some of these ethical challenges which stem from the financial situation should ease.
I think anyone who is democratically minded, we normally go with the cliche, we have 3 pillars to a democratic polity. We talk about legislature, we talk about executive, we talk about judiciary. And informally we say media or journalism is the 4th pillar. But the first 3 have legislations and practices and regulations guiding them. Media is not a licensed profession. It's not like being a lawyer, it's not like being a doctor. So we operate on kind of principles which have become folklore. That means which can be interpreted in whichever way you would like to interpret. For the past 400, 500 years of the history of world journalism, out of which we can also proudly say Indian journalism has a solid, vibrant history of 400 years. But let me, probably before arriving at the IAPM or any of the specific issues, I was quite shaken by an advertisement, sort of in a positive way, by an advertisement for an editor's job in 1930s. This is an early 1930s, a Hindi newspaper called Swaraja. This is not Mahatma Gandhi newspaper, Swaraj. This is another newspaper. It, while outlining the qualification that they're looking for an editor, which is, you should be good in so and so subjects, and you should be a good writer, and so forth. It also said, as in the last paragraph, that those who are prepared to go to Kalapani, Andaman's jail, only they need to apply for the job. So this is 1930s, and of course we can understand the climate was very political. India also in that sense has a unique case where 75% of our freedom fighting leadership were journalists of one sort or the other. Either they ran publications on their own or they were regular contributors in whichever language they chose to write. So our writing culture, our speaking culture, our debating culture was very, very fertile in this country. And we always identified idealism and principled conduct as sort of a main pillar in many aspects of our public life, but especially in journalism. And compare the 1930 job announcement for a journalist to that of probably something that we could come across today. There are no jobs for editors which gets announced, but there are those informal wordings and conversations that you normally get to hear and have. Today, while also the first part of the job requirement is intact, which you got to be perhaps have a body of work before you raise claim for a job. But the second part of it, the idealism bit, you are unfashionable if you try to if you believe and practice certain principles in the profession, which at the first place bring you to the job. So they expect, especially the people who control the business, they would expect editors who are willing to compromise a bit on, perhaps in some cases, much bigger, in a much bigger scale for the job. You also should fit into the political social climate of the country. You should also, in business terms, should swim along with the business side of your industry, which has certain wisdom and over the years, which not to probably blame individual CEOs and people like that, but this is how the industry has progressed over the years. So no one really want to take a chance with anyone who might slightly disagree on any of these grounds or the established wisdom of how to run media industry. So 1930s, you got to be willing to go to Kalapani. Today, forget about going to Kalapani, but you got to be doing things which are probably the extreme opposite of what the situation then was. For sense of clarity, let me divide the topic, so the challenges of media ethics into probably two kinds. One is the challenges that we face on the individual values of individual journalists, editors, owners, publishers, at the individual level, very individual level, the personal level. The second is the institutional level, not necessarily the institution of, let's say, A Times of India or Hindustan Times or whatever, but the institution of journalism per se. I'll probably start with the personal values. Media does not operate in vacuum, and it is part of society, and in general in society, from any profession you take, there is a kind of degradation in values and the willingness to dilute values in the profession, in all course of life in India. And probably also in work, but let me stick to India. And especially at the level of leadership, I wouldn't probably bring in young generation of aspiring professionals here, because they also make a very clever adjustment by the time they are entering into profession, because they're told to do so. If not told to do so, then they are intelligent enough to know who are going to be successful in this trade. So they make that self-adjustment. So the individual corruption, I would use the word corruption, not necessarily come with a financial motive all the time. It could also be your willingness or your drive to advance your name in the profession, to make a name for yourself, to get a better job. So in any of these aspects, you could be greedy also financially. At the level of individual practice of the profession, you are willing to compromise, and that has I think this we have to see it from while looking at the institution, because institutional debates will make all of us comfortable not to address the personal challenges or the personal sincerity we will be will be showing at our own end. Are we, if you are a startup reporter, if people are distributing umbrellas or small places, whatever places, or any of the sort of goodies. I'm not talking about stationery like pen and pencil perhaps, but if you go for any of these media conferences or press conferences, or if you go and meet some high-end official, will you be taking those? I mean, will you get tempted for small change? Will you get attracted for that? So from a very personal level, and will you sort of be sorry to use this word, will you be an asswipe, sort of, with a very ugly boss of yours who circumvenes values, and will you do that, or will you stand by what you are taught or what you think should be the ideal practice? So a very small 20 to 23-year-old who enter in this profession to a big editor to honor, we personally have to probably look at some of these values, how well we fare in all this. So then personal values, let me I would also like to probably tell you an example of personal Luton's Delhi, the Delhi that me and Shavanti come from. Unlike many other Indian cities, you also have a sort of a third kind of, you could divide the sort of city life into a third level in Delhi. You have your suburbs and then your slums like any other Indian cities. You also have your hardworking middle class and upper middle class buying their own apartments and then owning some of the bungalows or inheriting some of it which your parents or grandparents may have worked. But you also have sort of a tiny bit in terms of population, but in vast area called the sort of central Delhi. So you have your politicians, everyone having given big bungalows, big lawns, you have good party space, and real estate is very expensive. So if you're an editor and if you want to host a dinner party for your daughter's wedding or your son's wedding, these are small things. Normally, I sometimes get surprised how big editors really host on your children's wedding at let's say the opposition leaders' bungalow or significant minister's bungalow. So by doing that, you are not just selling yourself. You are also, because if you're an editor, you are also surrendering the independence of 100 or 200 reporters and editors who are working for you. So these are things that carelessness, to some extent, sort of your pompousness, you want to sort of show that you have access to power. So that's a very personal level corruption. And we also got to be, when we talk about media ethics, if we have to also address, which is an uncomfortable area of addressing, because some of them are our own friends and colleagues, and I wouldn't really want them to probably get stripped out in public in all cases. But at least if they don't address this issue and have that sort of bullshit detector inside them, then you are really going to walk this line where you are not just taking your reputation, but you're taking the reputation of the profession, the journalism along with you. So let me now come to the journalistic institution, the degradation of values in the journalistic institution. Some of it, Seventy very nicely put the challenges that we face. The foremost challenge comes from business. And media is an industry, so every industry needs to make profit. And then the question is how much profit? That's then the pressure starts building up, and for in the last 20 years, when we have opened our market, and the media industry, industrialists also thought that they should be compared to the profits that others make in other industries. Their family members who are in the business, or their friends who are in the business, from mining to steel to whatever, where the percentage of your profit is much higher. And media owners, some of them started comparing themselves with in their performance with other industrialists. This is where I think the pressure starts building up on the CEOs, on the marketing side of your job, on the industry, and also on the editors, and on the state bureau chiefs, and so on and so forth. Not to upset a certain big power with your stories, and it's sort of, this is even on a friendly terms put across, but the business pressure starts building up. And the general practice, I think the general sort of unrecorded but verbal understanding is that you have to make, from the owner to the business side, is that you have to help me make 20% profit this year. So every year 20% profit is sort of a huge task, and then how do you make 20% profit at least? You have to, you have to get more advertising, and B, you have to cut your cost on editorial, and C, you have to cut your cost on distribution, and so on and so forth. So this task is left to an MBA who is not necessarily grown up with the journalistic climate of committing yourself to ethics, and there is not necessarily always the same amount of understanding on how large a role that you as an institution should be playing, and this is not just an industry. So this pressure is then passed on to people, and then I can understand probably the same pressure that Dainik Bhaskar, Haryana bureau chief, and then everyone is being passed over. So cumulatively, the pressure is not necessarily from the person who is the sort of managing editor, but the owner wants 20%, or let's say, if you want bluntly put it. So then this is passed down. Then this is a managing editor's job, or salary hike for next year is dependent on whether you deliver that promise or whether you deliver the task. And Seventy also mentioned these two words, private treaties and paid news. Let me explain a little bit. I mean, for probably I would imagine many of you would know, but if there are students who probably don't know about these two concepts. Private treaties is a very innovative quote-unquote business practice that the Times of India started some time ago. This is when if there is a potential advertiser who keep on advertising in the newspaper, or who wants to get their message out in the newspaper, and they can't afford it, or they feel like they should not spend that much liquidity, that means cash, on advertising, then the Times of India has a wonderful plan for you, that you advertise in our newspaper. You don't need to give us money, but give us some stake in your company. So this way, by now Times of India has stakes in over 400 companies. And so then when you report on those companies, how do you, then these are the companies that you own in some sense. So how well do you practice your ethics there? So that's one larger question that private treaties throw up. And remember, private treaties, Times of India may have started it, but almost all big Indian newspaper and magazine and television companies have this by now. And everyone has imitated, most of them, I'm not saying everyone, most of them have imitated Times of India in this. It's only that the blame now goes to Times of India, but that's not the case. In actual practice, many companies have this. And paid news was shocking enough when they went to politicians and asked money. Until then, no one complained, and politicians took up this issue, saying, "Oh, what's going on? You know, for an election, your editors and your journalists are asking money for your honors." But this has been around for a very, very, very long time. And also in entertainment, which I think Paramita would know a lot, this has been the case with all these page 3 supplements. And Times of India, you would get Hyderabad Times here as and I don't know whether you took note of the sort of small tiny little line which goes under the the Hyderabad Times master, which says advertorial, sort of paid feature or something. So that means the Hyderabad Times that you very reverently take to your bedroom or whatever, or your bathroom, to kind of go through the news of entertainment is paid content. So Shah Rukh Khan decides how much he has to pay for, how much, if there is a movie out, or if there is some article that has to be reported in the paper. And so it also shapes your cultural values and your aesthetics on what kind of movies to go and watch, and what's happening in the country in arts and aesthetics. So it goes a big way. So this is also a paid content. So these are not journalistic content which goes through a vetting process where the merit of the story is being picked up on the basis of that, the merit, and then a well-trained journalist well-trained journalist's mind is at work at the ground level. It's not like that at all. And about business pressure, I would like to take Shravanti's point one more step ahead about Dainik Bhaskar owning power company, DB Power. It's not just that they own power companies, and when the ethical question raises only when they write about power. I don't know if you guys have followed, it's also not a blame of yours, because media, we didn't do a good job with that. When Colgate scam broke out, at least 4 media companies were direct beneficiaries of Colgate scam. And we almost did a complete censorship of the scam because of that. And Dainik Bhaskar is one of them. And they lied on the documentation, because the power license, the call blocks are given to those companies which had past experience in producing power and or operating mining blocks. And Dainik Bhaskar with DB Power, they lied to the government and secured these licenses. And there's some 37 call blocks, if I remember the number right. There's some 37 call blocks that they got. Likewise, Lok Satta, the largest selling Marathi newspaper, and these are all 24 million circulations, 20 million circulations, huge publications that we are talking about. And the publishing industry also work very closely. So if you are on the wrong side of the law, then you got to help your friend in the same industry. So that more or less that dictum works here.
World of net, the digital space. Um, both Shivanti and Vinod spoke extensively about the whole dilemma of ethical journalism and about how there isn't really anything perhaps called ethical journalism, because in a way many journalists deliberately or unintentionally get compromised at various levels, whether it is at the senior level of the editor or whether it's at the junior level of a reporter, correspondent, oblique stringer. When we started off in journalism, when we used to hear the word gifted journalists, it used to give a good feeling. Unfortunately now when you say gifted journalist, actually has several different connotations. When I came to Hyderabad in '95, I was introduced to one of very senior upcountry journalists saying that he's a very gifted journalist. And I actually took him literally. It was only later I was told that he's a gifted journalist also in different senses. Now when you write a column, and one of the very common accusations that are thrown at you is that this is a paid article, you are paid media. How much money did you get for this? How much did XYZ pay you for this? So sometimes you get accused of being paid by the Congress, sometimes by the BJP, sometimes by XYZ other party. So in a sense, if it was really the case, I'm sure most journalists would be making a lot of money if you're really getting paid by a lot of different political oblique corporate masters. That, according to me, has been the bane. And as my former colleague Ravish Kumar in NDTV says, earlier when we used to go to Mufassil towns, villages, small towns, or even when you're doing a live for a whole day, there would be people in the neighborhood who would come and offer you tea, coffee, offer you water, etc. And he said, "Aajkal koi nahi karta hai." And he kind of linked this to the decline in the credibility of the journalist, saying that journalism and journalist is not a profession, is not a tribe that is really respected. I would tend to agree with him to an extent that yes, the aura around the journalist, if I may use the term, has kind of diminished to a substantial extent, and it's really I don't mean to kind of dispirit you in any way, the fact that you're all entering the world of journalism at this time. But yes, for instance, I'm also a visiting faculty at Manipal, and I was quite surprised that out of the batch of 55 students who I was teaching for a week or two, much to my dismay, I found that 48 of them actually want to get into corporate communications, and only 7 of them want to get into journalism. Out of that 7, there are only 2 who are getting into audiovisual journalism. And even those 2 wanted to do the NDTV Good Times kind of journalism. Which seriously means television journalists must be doing something drastically wrong. Which is why you're not able to attract younger talent to actually become news television journalists. And this, according to me, is a very worrying trend. The reasons for this trend may be many. One, that both Shivanti and Vinod touched upon, the ownership pattern. The fact that now you have lots of political and corporate owners taking ownership stake directly or indirectly, which you may not even know in many cases. Political ownership is pretty much flaunted, so you come to know that XYZ politician owns XYZ channel. In Andhra Pradesh, which I think has the largest number of channels, about 23 news channels, 16, 17 of them prominent. And I would say about 80 to 85% of them are owned by one politician or the other. So what's the kind of news that you're getting? You're obviously getting news which suits the convenience, which suits what the proprietor of the channel, owner of the channel wants to tell you. So if you tune into a particular kind of channel, for instance, if you tune into a Sakshi, you will get the pro-Jagan kind of news. If you tune into a T News or a V6, you will get the pro-Telangana news. You tune into the pro-TDP channels, though they're not directly owned by the TDP, you get a more sympathetic view of Chandrababu Naidu's world. Then there are many channels which owe their allegiance to the Congress. There are lots of also independent channels, which also are not truly independent in the true sense of the word, because they also get compromised at various levels. And this is not just meant to be a critique of Andhra Pradesh. This happens in many, many states, in many other kind of regional and vernacular media. I'll come to the national media in a while. So You had a case in 2004, for instance, where the TDP actually paid a bribe of 15 lakhs, 5 lakhs to each of the 3 reporters, all 3 belonging to national channels, and then complained to the proprietor, who subsequently sacked them. Today you have a situation 9 years hence where it's almost been institutionalized the way political rallies, political meetings, padayatras, etc. are covered for a price. TV channels actually say, okay, this is our tariff card, rate card, if you want this kind of coverage. Earlier, again, I go back to 2004, where you had cases of district correspondents actually making money on news coverage. It came to the level of the news editor sitting in Hyderabad, who would say that, okay, if you want your story, a particular candidate in a particular district, in a particular constituency, if you want a positive story on that candidate to be carried between, say, 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, or a slot in the 9 p.m. primetime news, you will be charged X amount. And frankly, for a candidate who is spending crores of money on his campaign, a few thousands rupees really doesn't matter much. It's small change. So that's where the kind of corruption, paid media of a different kind started. Yes, of course, the paid media, in the way we know of newspapers, etc., taking money for charging, whatever we know about it. I'm talking specifically about television. National media, probably it's a little more subtle, a little more refined, where you do not come to know about it because it's mostly hidden. You do have influences, especially by corporates, by politicians sitting either in Delhi, who would use their influence to ensure that a negative story does not get carried, it doesn't get big play, or a positive news actually gets big play. It happens with lots of stories, and sometimes you notice it because it's very blatant. Sometimes you do not notice it because it's done in a slightly subtle manner. You have had cases, for instance, during the Ramalinga Raju case. I came to know of it much later, but I've had the case of the PricewaterhouseCoopers guy actually calling up and shouting because we were saying that the 2 auditors of PwC were actually going to be arrested. Why? Because he was also NDTV's auditor. I had, in my 17 years in NDTV, I never faced any kind of pressures of that kind. That was probably the only instance where I actually faced pressures, not directly from NDTV initially, but first from the PwC guy, and thereafter from an editorial guy saying that can we not mention it this day. We were justified because a couple of days later he was actually, both the guys were arrested and subsequently debarred from doing any kind of CA work by their parent organization. So these kind of pressures do take place. It's finally the call of the editorial team on how they want to play, because on the field the correspondent is pretty much powerless to a large extent, but yes, the editorial team, the management has to take a call on what kind of a line it wants to take on a particular news story. Earlier, of course, we used to have the concept of the letters to the editor. Now, of course, everyone is a journalist, everyone can be a reporter, every consumer can be a reporter, because you have this powerful tool called the digital media, the social media, where he or she, anyone can actually express what they think is the news of the day, on what kind of take should be there, and how the mainstream media is probably not kind of covering it in the manner in which it should probably cover, or the usual rant, that it's a compromise.
I've prepared in a different way for this, but the very interesting remarks made by everybody else, I self-edited myself. Self-censorship, let me start with 7, which you might shoot me for this. So I'm going to switch what I was going to say originally, but you don't know what I was going to say, so let me not go you with that. I'll start with a couple of pictures and then go to the larger observations I wanted to make, and then come back to this again in the end. That's a cover page of a magazine. It's called Citizen Matters. I've got a few of these here with me. And following in the city of Bangalore is working in the city of Bangalore. I don't know if it will work in other cities. I believe it will. We combine citizen journalism for about 1/3 of our stories. The other 2 come from staff journalism. We actually hire them from journalism schools like this. I'm surprised nobody from Citizen Matters. A lot of people from other schools apply, but you have to know some students from who want to apply. Please feel free. So we take staff journalism and we take citizen engagement, turn that into citizen journalism, and we create a product like this, which basically focuses on the city as a country. I've always believed that Indian cities are too large to allow daily newspapers to sort of do 2-3 pages of crime, social activity, page 3, and then say we've done the city. Our cities have 8 million, 7 million, 4 million people, sometimes 10 million people, all of that. Now, in that sense, the city of Bangalore would actually be a country somewhere else. If you go to Belgium and you actually count the population of Belgium, it's probably less than Bangalore. So the issues are wide. There's plenty of vibrancy of activity. There's plenty of interesting things people are doing. People are trying to change things as well. And at the same time, there's all the usual power structure problems, corruption, social issues, parties, all of those things are happening, which to some degree are already explained by the other people. So what we've done here is we've taken a citizen aspiration for change and we built a platform online that allows people to come in and say what they have to say. We call them voice pieces. And we let citizens alert us to what matters to them in their neighborhoods. It may be a big infrastructure project that's coming up that is fraud. Maybe a complete lie. It may be a good project that they want, but it's going too slow, and they want a story on that. It may be all of those things. So I'll just give you a couple of, I've only got 3 slides and then I'll switch this off. This is an example where the main city development authority, the equivalent of your HUDA, I mean you folks must know HUDA, right? Hyderabad Urban. So the equivalent of HUDA in our city is the BDA. The BDA lied in court. This is perjury. So it's not important to go over the exact story, but it was about going to the High Court and saying we won't do this. The very next day issuing the orders to say we're doing this. Nobody caught them because nobody watches the court cases on city-related topics as much as they watch a whole bunch of national cases. Now, these kinds of stories were actually possible not because we have the best journalists. We have pretty good journalists. In the last 4 years, 2 of my journalists have won awards. One international, one national. But that's not why these stories happen. These stories happen because we don't do an ivory tower approach to editing. Our approach to editing is simple. Call us, email us, let us know what's going on, send us a story if you can. If it's political, if it's controversial, we are not likely to accept it as a citizen piece. We're going to have to verify, we're going to have to cross-check. If we can sense from a story whether it can run by itself or whether we have to send a staff member. Because our team works with the residents associations in the city of Bangalore on a fairly active basis, the associations have members. See, there's an interesting demographic change happening in India now. There was a time when associational activity used to be led by people who are retired, 60 plus, 70 plus. I'm from CBI, I'm from the PSU, I know I'm retired, I'm in this colony, I'm the president of an association. What's happened in Bangalore now is people in their 30s to 50s are often office bearers of associations. They have a very different mindset. They have good jobs, they pay well, they want change, they don't have that much time, but they have weekends to do meetings to protect a lake, to improve a road, to take part in some particular charity campaign, and all of those things. So when you engage with that generation, you get a very different dynamic. One, they're quick. 2, they come online and tell you that you're a fool, you shouldn't have run that story, the story has a mistake, I was never at that event, that politician did not make that commitment. They'll tell you pretty quickly that you're wrong. They'll also tell you that what's really important to them. The result of that kind of engagement is that you can follow a story with the help of citizens, because you don't have staff journalists for all the major stories, and you can put out some pretty major stories that actually matter to people on the ground. This one exposed a fraud, as a result of which a major project that was going to happen in a part of South Bangalore, after the tendering process, after the bribe was given, after everybody said that this project is going to happen. Because the contractor, the MLA, the Urban Development Authority, the minister, it's all green lighted. Why are you guys trying to stop it? We're living in India. This is what they said. You come to that part of Bangalore now, the project doesn't exist.